Hi, everyone. This is Emily. Today, I want to share a story that might change the way you see hope. It's about a man who lost everything: his family, his home, his dreams, but never gave up. He lived on the streets, surrounded by cold nights and endless fear. Yet, he kept a spark alive inside. This story is not only about survival, it's about learning, kindness, and the power of belief. You'll hear how a simple act of compassion opened the door to change and gave him a second chance. Along the way, we'll explore lessons about courage, patience, and how small steps can lead to big growth. So, find a quiet moment, take a deep breath, and join me on this journey of hope and transformation. Because sometimes, all it takes is one small light to guide you out of the dark. When we talk about starting from nothing, it often sounds simple, but in reality, it's a storm. Today, let me take you into the story of a man who faced that storm, alone and unprepared. He wasn't born into tragedy. He was just like any of us, a boy with dreams, laughter, and hope. He went to school, played with friends, and believed the future would be bright. But life doesn't always follow our plans. His family began to fall apart piece by piece. First came the arguments, then silence, and finally, separation. One morning, they were simply gone. He was left behind, with no home, no support, and nowhere to go. Just the streets and his fear. At first, he stayed with distant relatives, but help has limits, and their kindness faded with time. Soon, he found himself sleeping in parks, hiding under bridges, searching for warmth. The city, once full of energy, now felt cold and cruel. People passed by without seeing him. He wasn't invisible because of magic, but because no one wanted to look. His clothes grew thinner, his hands rougher, his hope smaller. Each day became a battle to survive. Sometimes he went hungry. Sometimes he fought to find a dry place during the rain. Every night he listened to the sounds of the city: cars, voices, and loneliness. Fear lived beside him. Would someone hurt him? Would he wake up tomorrow? He didn't know. And yet, even in that darkness, something refused to die inside him. A small, stubborn light. It whispered softly, "This is not the end. One day, things will change." He remembered his mother's voice, the way she told stories that made the world feel safe. Those memories became his shelter when he had none. They kept him warm when the nights were too long. He started to notice little things: a sunrise after a cold night, a stranger's kind glance, tiny signs that maybe the world hadn't completely forgotten him. But make no mistake, hope wasn't easy. It was fragile, like glass in his hands. Some days he wanted to give up, to stop fighting, to let the darkness win. And still, he didn't. Every morning he stood up, tired and cold, but still breathing, still trying. That's what courage really is. Not big, heroic gestures, but choosing to face another day. Over time, he learned things the hard way: how to find food, where to rest, how to stay unseen. He learned that the hardest part of being alone isn't hunger, it's being forgotten. People judged him by his clothes, by his smell, by his silence. They called him lazy or weak, but they didn't see his struggle. They didn't see the boy still fighting inside. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. You never really know someone's story until you listen. One morning, something changed. He sat on a bench, hungry, tired, ready to give up. Then a woman stopped in front of him. She smiled, a real smile. She handed him a cup of tea and a small sandwich. It was a simple act, but it lit up his heart. For the first time in months, someone saw him, not as a stranger, but as a person. The warmth of the tea spread through his hands and into his spirit. The fear didn't disappear, but it softened. That moment was small, but it was the beginning of change. From that simple kindness, a seed of hope began to grow again. He didn't know what the future would bring. He didn't have a plan, but he had a spark. And sometimes that's all you need to start over. A spark, a small act of kindness, a reason to believe again. This is how his new journey began. From nothing, with nothing, except a heart that refused to give up. The morning was cold, and the sky hung heavy with gray clouds. The streets were already alive. Cars passed, people hurried, but no one noticed the man sitting quietly on a bench. His clothes were worn, his hands rough, and his eyes tired. He had stopped expecting kindness. Days had passed without a warm word, without a single smile. He had become used to silence. But that morning, something unexpected happened. A woman stopped in front of him. She didn't look away. She didn't pretend he wasn't there. Instead, she smiled. In her hands, a cup of hot tea, a small sandwich wrapped in paper. Simple things, yet full of meaning. At first, he didn't move. His instinct told him not to trust. People rarely stopped without reason, but hunger and cold were stronger than fear. Slowly, he looked up and whispered, "Thank you." That moment changed everything. The warmth of the tea traveled from his hands to his heart. It wasn't just about food. It was about being seen again, being acknowledged as human. The woman sat beside him, speaking softly. Her words were gentle, like a melody in the noise. She asked about his name, his story, where he slept at night, questions few ever cared to ask. At first, he hesitated. It had been so long since someone wanted to listen. But her voice carried no judgment, only kindness. And that made him trust a little more. For the first time in months, he felt like more than a shadow in the crowd. The woman told him she worked at a small shelter nearby, a place for people like him. There he could shower, rest, and get clean clothes. A simple offer, but a difficult choice. Trust had been broken too many times before. What if it was a trick? What if he wasn't welcome? He thought about it, his heart heavy with doubt. But deep inside, hope whispered again. Maybe this was the moment he had been waiting for. Maybe kindness was the key he needed. Finally, he nodded. A small gesture, but full of courage. He chose to follow her. They walked together side by side. Each step felt lighter than the one before. The city noise faded behind them, replaced by the quiet sound of possibility. When they reached the shelter, he froze at the door. Warm light spilled from inside. Volunteers greeted him with smiles and open hearts. No judgment, no fear, just welcome. Someone handed him a towel. Another offered fresh clothes. For a moment, he wanted to cry. He hadn't seen kindness like this in so long. It felt almost unreal. He stepped into the shower. Warm water touched his skin, washing away more than just dirt. It washed away shame, exhaustion, and the weight of being invisible. When he looked into the mirror afterward, he barely recognized himself. The man staring back was still tired, but alive. His eyes held something new, hope. That night, he lay in a clean bed for the first time in months. The pillow felt soft, the room safe. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of peace. It felt strange, but beautiful. As he closed his eyes, he thought of the woman's smile, the tea, the warmth, the simple word, care. He realized something powerful. Sometimes it takes only one small act to change a life. That single gesture had reminded him that good still existed in the world. He made a promise to himself that night to try again, to trust, and to move forward. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he knew one thing. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone had reached out, and that was enough to spark something deep within him. In life, we often underestimate the power of small kindnesses, but they can rebuild broken souls. A smile, a word, a cup of tea. They can restore faith faster than grand speeches ever could. That morning had started with cold and gray skies, but it ended with warmth, courage, and light. And that light would guide him toward a new chapter, one filled with hope and possibility. The days after that first act of kindness were not easy, but they were different. Something had shifted. He was still poor, still struggling, but inside him, a tiny seed of hope had started to grow again. At the shelter, he found a small corner with a few books and an old computer. It became his favorite place. He wasn't sure why he was drawn there at first. Maybe curiosity, maybe the memory of who he used to be. One day, he picked up a book with large letters and simple words. It was an English learner's guide. The first page was hard. He stumbled over the letters, the sounds, the meaning. It felt impossible, but something inside him whispered, "Try again." And so, he did, slowly, one word at a time. At first, he could barely pronounce anything correctly. But every day he returned to that same corner. He read, he listened, he practiced. The words were strange, but they were also powerful. With each new word, he felt like he was unlocking a door to a world he had once lost. Sometimes he smiled when he could read a full sentence without stopping. It felt like climbing a mountain. Learning gave him purpose. It was no longer just about survival. It was about rebuilding. And that's the thing about learning. It's a quiet kind of hope. It doesn't happen fast, but it transforms you. At night, when others slept, he would whisper new words softly, practicing until his eyes closed. He didn't have a teacher, just persistence and a desire to change his story. Over time, he began to help others at the shelter too, translating small things or explaining signs. His confidence grew. The fear that once ruled his life started to fade into the background. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He felt capable, alive, and learning. He also began to talk to people more often. His English was broken, but his effort spoke louder than words. Some laughed kindly at his mistakes. Others encouraged him to keep going. And he did. Every attempt, every small success reminded him that growth comes from patience. He found a notebook and started writing down words he didn't know. Each one became a new friend. Sometimes he drew pictures beside the words, trying to remember them better. Learning became joy. He realized something profound. Language wasn't just about communication. It was about connection. Through English, he could talk to people, understand stories, and dream bigger dreams. The more he learned, the more he began to believe in himself again. He wasn't just learning a language. He was rebuilding his identity. One sentence, one page, one mistake at a time. And that's the beautiful part about learning. It gives you permission to start over. Each day he practiced, the street version of himself, the scared, lost man, grew smaller. In his place stood someone stronger, someone who believed change was possible. Sometimes he wondered why this mattered so much. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but then he remembered how it felt to be unseen. And he promised himself never to return to that place. He didn't want just to live. He wanted to grow, to learn, to stand tall again. One afternoon, as he sat reading under the soft light of the shelter, he realized something powerful. The hardest part of life isn't losing everything. It's losing faith in yourself. And through each small lesson, each quiet victory, he was learning to believe again. He understood now that progress isn't loud. It doesn't shout or demand attention. It happens slowly, in the moments when you choose to keep going despite fear and doubt. The road ahead was still long. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. He had found his strength again, hidden deep inside learning. He wasn't the same man who once sat on that cold bench. He was becoming someone new, someone who could read the signs around him, ask questions, and dream without fear. That night, as he closed his notebook, he whispered a quiet thank you to life, to hope, to the power of learning. Because sometimes the smallest step toward knowledge becomes the biggest step toward change. After weeks of learning, he finally found an opportunity. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. A small restaurant was looking for someone to clean tables and wash dishes. The pay was low, but it was a start. When he heard the news, his heart raced. This was his first chance to rebuild a life, step by step. The first morning on the job, he woke up early, nervous, but ready. The city felt different that day, full of hope. He arrived at the restaurant with his hands trembling slightly, unsure of what to expect. The noise of clinking plates, conversations, and orders being shouted filled the air. It was chaos, but beautiful chaos. He was surrounded by people who moved quickly. Speaking fast English he could barely understand. Every sentence sounded like a blur. Every instruction was a challenge. Still, he listened carefully. He smiled when others spoke, even when he didn't fully understand. His body followed where his heart led, forward. The first few days were hard. He made mistakes. He cleaned the wrong tables, dropped dishes, spilled water. Each time, embarrassment burned in his chest. He wanted to disappear, but he didn't walk away. Instead, he apologized and tried again. That simple act, staying, was his quiet victory. He began learning new words at work: clean, order, delivery, kitchen, plate. Each one was a tool for progress. During his breaks, he practiced those words softly to himself, whispering them like small prayers. The staff noticed his effort. Some smiled and helped him pronounce words correctly. Others offered small advice. For the first time, he felt part of a team, not just a man surviving, but a worker contributing something real. There were still moments of doubt. Sometimes he wondered if he was good enough. When customers frowned or the manager looked impatient, fear crept back in. But he didn't let it control him. He reminded himself of how far he'd come, from the streets to this kitchen, from silence to learning. That memory kept him grounded. It reminded him that progress is made one small step at a time. Slowly, his confidence began to grow. His hands worked faster. His English became clearer. He started greeting customers with short phrases, small hellos that filled him with pride. Even when his grammar wasn't perfect, his sincerity made people smile. Work became more than just survival. It became purpose. Every clean table was proof he could rebuild his life. And in those small victories, he discovered something powerful. Discipline creates hope. It's not magic or luck. It's the courage to show up again, even when yesterday was hard. Some evenings, after closing time, he stayed behind to help a coworker or clean one last table. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because he wanted to be proud of himself again. One older worker, noticing his dedication, began teaching him short English phrases each night. "Keep going," the man would say. "You're doing great." Those words became his motivation. With every week that passed, he felt less like an outsider. He was no longer just the new guy. He belonged. He started saving small amounts of money, one coin at a time. Each coin felt like a promise to his future. He began dreaming again, not of riches or fame, but of stability, of dignity. And maybe that's what real success looks like: finding pride in simple, honest work. He learned that responsibility wasn't just a burden, it was strength. It gave him structure and purpose. He no longer measured life by what he had lost, but by what he was building. Some nights, walking home after a long shift, he looked up at the city lights and smiled. Those lights used to remind him of everything he didn't have. Now, they reminded him of everything he could become. Because every journey forward, no matter how small, begins with one brave decision: to try again. His story was no longer about loss. It was about resilience, effort, and hope reborn through hard work. And as he wiped down that last table one evening, he realized something beautiful. He wasn't just cleaning. He was clearing the path to his future. One sweep, one word, one dream at a time. Weeks passed, and life at the restaurant slowly became more stable. He worked hard, kept learning, and stayed humble. But one day, something happened that would change his path again. He met someone who saw his potential. His name was David, a kind man, soft-spoken, with eyes full of understanding. David was a volunteer and a teacher. He often came to the restaurant for lunch. While others saw just a worker, David saw something deeper. One afternoon, as he cleaned the tables, David stopped and said, "You work hard, you must have a story." The man smiled shyly, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to people asking about his life with kindness. But David waited patiently, his smile calm and genuine. So, little by little, the man began to share. He talked about his struggles, his mistakes, and the small victories that kept him going. David listened carefully, never interrupting. He didn't judge or pity. He simply understood. After a while, David said softly, "I teach English at a community center nearby. You should come by sometime." The invitation surprised him. No one had invited him to learn since he lost everything. He hesitated. Old doubts returned. Fear of failure. Fear of not belonging. But David's tone was warm, his belief steady. "You're already learning," he said. "You just need a little guidance." Those words planted a new seed in his heart. That evening, he decided to visit the community center. The next day after work, he walked there nervously. The building was small, but the energy inside felt bright. He stepped in, and David greeted him like an old friend. "Welcome," he said. "You've already taken the hardest step." The class was small, just a few people, all trying to improve their English, all chasing hope in different ways. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. Everyone there understood what it meant to start over. David taught patiently. He didn't just focus on grammar or vocabulary. He taught through stories and conversations. Each lesson carried something more. Lessons about life, patience, and believing in yourself. "Success," David said once, "is like planting a tree. You water it daily, even when you see no change." Those words stayed with him. Every time he felt tired, he remembered that growth takes time. David became more than a teacher. He became a mentor, a guide, and a friend. He encouraged him to dream again, not just to survive, but to create something meaningful. Together, they practiced English every day. David corrected his words, but also built his confidence. They talked about jobs, ideas, and the future. For the first time, the man dared to imagine more. He started thinking about opening a small business, a place that could give others the same chance he had been given. When he shared this idea, David didn't laugh. Instead, he said, "That's a wonderful dream. Let's make it real." Under David's mentorship, he began to learn not only language, but also leadership. He learned how to set goals, manage time, and plan small steps toward bigger visions. Sometimes doubt crept in again. whispers of the past telling him he wasn't good enough. But David was always there with encouragement. "You've come too far to stop now," he would remind him. The lessons extended beyond words. David showed him that kindness and discipline could rebuild any life. Through every conversation, he found pieces of himself returning: confidence, curiosity, courage. He realized that mentors don't just teach, they light the path when you can't see the way forward. Slowly, he began to believe he could be more than his past. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was a student of life, and that belief changed everything. He started saving money, planning small goals, and writing new dreams. His relationship with David became a symbol of hope, proof that one person's belief can transform another. He now saw the world differently. Every word learned, every conversation had meaning. It wasn't just English he was learning. It was the language of self-worth, of growth, of second chances. By the time he left class that evening, he realized something beautiful. He wasn't walking alone anymore. He had a guide, a friend, and most importantly, a new belief in what was possible. Because sometimes what changes your life isn't money or luck. It's someone who believes in you before you do. After months of learning with David, something inside him began to change again. Hope became direction. For the first time, he allowed himself to dream, not just about surviving, but about creating. The idea started small. What if he could start a business of his own? Something honest, something meaningful. At night, after long shifts at the restaurant, he would sit by the window and imagine his future. He saw himself running a small shop, greeting customers, helping others like him find work. But along with the dream came fear. How could a man with no money, no education, and no connections start anything? Those thoughts whispered doubts in his mind. But he had learned something important. Fear only wins if you stop moving. So instead of giving up, he started asking questions. He talked to David, to coworkers, and to anyone who would listen. David smiled and said, "Big dreams start with small steps. You don't need everything figured out. Just begin." Those words became his mantra. Begin, learn, grow, one day at a time. He began reading books about small businesses from the library. They were difficult, but he didn't quit. He wrote down new words in his notebook: customer, budget, profit, investment. Each one was a tool for his dream. Every evening, he practiced explaining his business idea in English, even when his voice shook. Sometimes, David would listen and gently correct his pronunciation. "Say it again," he'd encourage. Each time his voice grew stronger. Each word carried more confidence. He was learning more than business. He was learning belief. He saved every small coin he could, cutting unnecessary expenses and working extra hours when possible. He watched videos, took free online classes, and listened to podcasts about entrepreneurship. The more he learned, the more the dream felt real. It wasn't just an idea. It was a plan taking shape. But progress was slow, and doubt never completely disappeared. Some nights, he'd stare at the ceiling and ask himself, "Can I really do this?" In those moments, he remembered David's advice. Growth takes time. You water the dream every day, and one day it grows. So, he kept watering it, with work, learning, and patience. One afternoon, David helped him write a simple business plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was something solid. They listed goals, steps, and potential challenges. Seeing it on paper made it feel real. It was no longer a wish. It was a roadmap. Eventually, with the shelter's small support program, he received a tiny loan to begin. He decided to start by making handmade products, things he could craft and sell at the local market. It wasn't a big start, but it was his own effort, his own creation, his own risk. The night before opening day, he barely slept. Excitement and fear danced in his chest like fire and wind. He kept telling himself, I've come this far. I can't stop now. The next morning, he set up a simple wooden table, arranged his handmade items carefully, and took a deep breath. He looked around at the market, a place full of noise, life, and stories, and smiled. This was more than business. It was a declaration, a promise to himself that he would never go back to being invisible. That day, he didn't sell much, but every smile, every conversation, every curious glance meant something. People noticed his effort. A few even stopped to ask questions, and he practiced his English with pride. He realized that success wasn't measured by money yet. It was measured by courage. He had turned hope into action. He had become the kind of person who didn't just dream, but did. As the sun set and he packed up his small stall, he felt exhausted, but also deeply alive. He thought about the long road that had brought him here, from the streets to the shelter, from learning to creating. Every moment, every struggle had led to this, his first step into a new world. He whispered quietly, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, because now he understood something beautiful. Dreams don't start big. They start small, in quiet corners, with brave hearts. And when you nurture them with faith and work, they grow stronger than you ever imagined. The morning air was crisp as he set up his stall at the local market. This was the beginning of his dream: a simple wooden table, a few handmade items, and a heart full of hope. That's all he had. He looked around, surrounded by other vendors calling out to customers, each one fighting to be seen. He wasn't loud or confident. He just smiled, waiting, hoping someone would stop. At first, no one did. People walked by, glancing briefly, but never slowing down. Doubt whispered in his ear, "Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe you're not ready." But then he remembered David's words. Every dream begins small, every success begins with patience. So he stayed. He greeted everyone politely, even those who ignored him. A few customers stopped to look. Some asked questions he didn't fully understand. His English was shaky, and sometimes his answers came out wrong. But he kept smiling. One woman bought a small item and said, "You made this?" He nodded proudly. She smiled. That smile meant everything. It wasn't about the money. It was about connection, being seen again, being valued for what he created. Each day, he returned to the market. Some days were good, others painfully quiet. But he never gave up. He took notes after every day, writing what worked and what didn't. He improved his products, changed his prices, practiced his English with every conversation. The market became his classroom. Every mistake was a teacher. Every smile was a reward. Still, the challenges were real. Some weeks, he barely made enough to buy materials. Other days, a supplier delayed his orders, leaving his table half empty. Each setback tested his patience. Each problem whispered the same question: should I quit? But deep down, he knew quitting wasn't an option. He had already come too far to stop. So, he learned. When a customer complained, he listened carefully. When something failed, he found another way. Slowly, people began to notice. Regular customers returned, telling their friends about the kind man at the market. His English improved naturally, shaped by real conversations and genuine effort. He learned new words: price, delivery, discount, thank you. Simple words, powerful tools. Each interaction gave him confidence. Each sale gave him hope. But more than anything, each challenge gave him growth. He began to understand something profound. Success isn't built on luck, it's built on consistency. One morning, as he arranged his items, a neighbor from another stall smiled at him and said, "You're always here." He laughed softly and replied, "Yes, I'm learning." And he meant it, because every day at that market was a lesson in patience, humility, and courage. He started keeping track of his income and expenses in a small notebook. Numbers that once scared him now gave him control. When he earned enough to buy new materials, he felt a wave of pride. It wasn't much, but it was honest. He realized that growth doesn't happen in leaps. It happens in steady, small steps. Some days still felt heavy, and when sales were low, the old fears returned, the fear of losing everything again. But he'd take a deep breath, remind himself how far he had come, and keep going. He learned to celebrate small wins, a new customer, a kind word, a good day's work. He discovered that joy lives in progress, not perfection. One afternoon, a child walked up to his stall, staring curiously at the handmade items. The boy smiled and said, "My mom likes this." The man laughed, a soft, genuine laugh that came from peace. Moments like that reminded him why he started. Not for money, but for meaning. His little business wasn't just about selling. It was about rebuilding faith in himself and in others. Each morning, he stood behind his stall with gratitude. The same man who once begged now built. And even when challenges came, late deliveries, bad weather, slow sales, he faced them differently now. He no longer saw obstacles as endings. He saw them as lessons disguised as problems. One day, he looked around the market and realized something powerful. He was no longer surviving. He was living. His business was growing, slowly but surely. His confidence was stronger. His dream was real. He smiled to himself, knowing this was only the beginning. Because every great story of success starts the same way, with someone brave enough to start small. Looking back, his story isn't about luck. It's about courage, the quiet kind that grows from pain. He started with nothing, lost everything, and still found a reason to try again. Each small act, a smile, a word, a lesson, became a brick in the foundation of his new life. He proved that success isn't built overnight. It's built one step, one choice, one moment of faith at a time. Now, when he walks through the market, he no longer sees strangers. He sees stories, each person fighting their own battle. He's not just surviving anymore. He's living, growing, and helping others believe they can too. And maybe that's the real message. No matter how dark life gets, there's always a spark waiting to be found. All it takes is one step, one act of kindness, to turn hope into a new beginning.